Lost. My son had friends. He's name there. And I just love it. It was just like. I can still imagine that. Actually. Later. So he's like my well, good evening, afternoon. How are we? Good. Let's try it again. They don't know me. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Wonderful. Welcome. I'm just. Do you need it?
I think you're good. I'm just waiting for Chike to come in. Yeah, it is recorded. I need to make sure that I say that. Got 7 people here. That's 7 sure that is. Okay. Yeah, do you mind if I take pictures like for the sure. I don't mind at all.
On your mom's birthday. Yeah, they had really few. I haven't go random. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah.
He's waiting on our guest of honor, so just give us a couple of seconds. See if he needs any help logging on. You're getting to sleep.
No. I'm tired, my. No.
Hey, you need any help on that?
I'm sure. My church, I would have, my church would have resolution service, that's why I need to. But I wasn't.
Okay, sounds good. All right. He's logging in, just a couple of tech issues, but I'll go ahead and get started in the meantime. Good afternoon. Thank you all who have dedicated yourselves to one or more of these African American philosophy classrooms for Black History Month. My name is Dr. Corey Reed. For accessibility, I'd like to give my description. So I am a Black male wearing a Black African print shirt, some tan jeans, and some black shoes. All of this will be, number one, recorded, as well as there's active transcription that'll be happening for those who need that, both in person and on the Zoom. Thank you to all the Zoom folks. We already have 20 attendees. This is blowing my mind. I thought it was going to be my class and like 3 people. So I am already astounded by this. So again, my name is Dr. Corey Reed. I am an assistant professor of philosophy here at Butler University. I also serve as a steering committee member for the Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. And I am one of the 3 co-directors for the Hub for Black Affairs and Community Engagement. I want to thank the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, RGSS, Butler's DEI department, as well as LAS, and the Black and African Studies minor for their support. Today's format will start with a brief introduction on the topic. There'll be a 20-minute or so presentation by our guest speaker. A few preset questions have already been sent in, and then we'll have an open Q&A session. The open Q&A session will have priority to those who are my students in the room who, paid for the class. But then we'll open it up both to virtual attendees as well as in-person attendees. So, yeah, let me just go ahead and give my brief intro, and then hopefully Chike will be in here by the time we get done with that. So. Today's session is entitled Philosophy Born of Struggle, a phrase brought to fame by famous philosopher Leonard Harris, who created an anthology of African American philosophy predicated on Frederick Douglass's assertion that, quote, if there is no struggle, there is no progress, end quote. Struggle is one of the things that creates the conundrum of African American philosophy. The tying together of African philosophical traditions that survived the Middle Passage with the conditions of enslavement, the failures of Reconstruction, the oppression of Jim and Jane Crow, mass incarceration, and the moment we now recognize as Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black lives. Those eras in Black history, blended with developments in European and American philosophy, fostered a philosophical development anchored in the two-ness or double consciousness that W.B. Du Bois mentions in 1903. Before we get to Du Bois's examination of Black thought, however, I wanted to take us back to the era in which Black intellectuality was least assumed here in the United States. There are many, including some of the most revered philosophers like Kant and Hegel, that thought Africans were not capable of higher thought. This was the general thought during enslavement. However, a careful look at the documents from this era show us not only deep intellectual engagement, but unique and potent philosophical contributions. That's our Padlet. There he goes. All right, how's it going, Chike? You in here?
All right, let's see here.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can see,
Not yet.
I can see and hear you,
Okay, I'm gonna also
and
do a dual
trying to
screen.
see what's going on. Okay, can now you can now see me?
Can you hear me, Chike?
Hello, can you hear and see me?
I can't hear you.
I should you should be able to hear me now.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah or nay?
Okay, they say they can see and hear me.
They say they can hear and see you. Okay, so it's just us in the room. All right. Let's see here. Where is it?
I'll continue to speak. So, oh wait, there we go. All
Okay,
right.
I was just giving the intro, Chike, so I'll finish that and then I'll introduce you. Is that okay? Uh-oh. Are we back? Okay, I'm just gonna finish the introduction, okay? All right, so for some of our speakers for today, or some of our theorists that we're engaging for today, Equinano, for example, questions the morality of enslavers and imposed human metaphysics of the enslaved in both the Caribbean and America, saying, quote, "Is not the slave trade entirely a war with the heart of man? And surely that which is begun by breaking down the barriers of virtue involves in its continuance destruction to every principle and buries all sentiments in ruin," end quote. Sojourner Truth, in the version of her 1851 speech we believe to be most accurate, gives the socio-political critique that, quote, "You need not be afraid to give us our rights, for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold," end quote. Even in David Walker's assertive appeal, the existential condition of the human is coupled with a philosophy of religion that makes morally permissible the violent resistance of people like Nat Turner. Frederick Douglass, in his fight with Mr. Covey, reminds everyone that although physically bound and cornered by consequences, one maintains the choice and ability to fight back and reclaim their existential freedom. These thinkers proved that one, philosophy was being done during and beyond enslavement. Number two, that American philosophy cannot be fully understood without an examination of African American thought. And number three, that the pursuit of freedom and the intersecting lineages in the story of African descents of slavery provide a unique contribution not only to philosophy, but to the pursuit of defining humanity. There are very few philosophers that can trace the history of Black thought in the 18th and 19th centuries better than Dr. Chike Jeffers. Dr. Jeffers is an associate professor of philosophy at Dalhousie, did I say that correct?
Yes,
Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada. He is also one of the creators of the History Without Any Gaps podcast series. Beyond his litany of accolades in his forthcoming third book discussing Africana philosophy, Dr. Jeffers is a dear friend and a mentor in the field. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Chike Jeffers.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here with you all. And so I'm gonna try and share screen. Wait. So that I can share the screen.
Should be
Okay, I think it might be working now. It's this
Check out the advanced doc,
Right.
because it might be under,
Uh,
no, under share.
Okay, wait, I've got the wrong thing here, but let me just, okay, so share. Okay, is that working?
Yeah, that's working.
Okay, great. And I wanted to also show okay, I'm gonna just work with the this website first. I wanted to also show a picture of the cover of the forthcoming book that was just being mentioned, but I just want to start by bringing us here to the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps website, historyofphilosophy.net, because speaking with Professor Reed, it seemed to me that what I could help bring to the course through talking about what we attempted to accomplish in this podcast, the history of philosophy without any gaps, specifically the section on Africana philosophy. By talking about that, I can help to perhaps contextualize some of the various themes and figures that you all are studying in this African American philosophy course. So when you go to the website, you can click on Africana right here, and that brings you to this screen, which below here is bibliography, but what you really need are these three links right here to the 3 parts of the series. And I want to talk especially about the first 2 parts, locating and debating pre-colonial African philosophy and slavery and the creation of diasporic Africana philosophy, because these make up the book that is going to be out this year, Africana Philosophy from Ancient Egypt to the 19th Century. Peter Adamson and I, the co-authors of that book and of this podcast series, are still working on the sequel, which will be called simply Africana Philosophy in the 20th Century. This first link, and then you episode Something Old, Something New, introducing Africana philosophy. And I wanted to mention the meaning of the title there. On the one hand, Africana philosophy is something very, very new. Why? Well, the phrase has only really been used since, well, you can say it was born in 1982, and I'll come back to that point. But Africana philosophy. It is only then that the term starts being used by academics. Lewis Gordon takes it up very prominently. And by the time you get to our current century, and the 2000s, the teens, and now the 20s, right now it's a very common term used by many in philosophy, and there are jobs advertised for people specializing in it and so on. But that's really a thing of this century for it to be a common term in that sense. So it's in that sense something very, very new. On the other hand, part of what I think is important about what we managed to say in this series, in this podcast series, is that as we explain in episode 2, It's Only Human, Philosophy in Prehistoric Africa, some pretty safe assumptions lead very quickly to the conclusion that philosophy had to have been born in Africa, and philosophy had to have been born in Africa uh, many tens of thousands of years before the term philosophy itself was born in ancient Greece, right? And so we explore that, thesis in the second episode there. It's worth noting that people from the Africana world have often questioned the claim that philosophy was born in ancient Greece. And there are famously scholars, especially those influenced by a book called Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James. It's very common to say, well, no, actually, philosophy was born in ancient Egypt, right? And the Greeks learned from the Egyptians. And sometimes that story of the Egyptian and Greek connection is told in more credible ways and sometimes in more fantastical ways. But it's worth noting how different the claim of philosophy being born in Africa is being asserted here in our podcast, because the claim here is not that philosophy was born in ancient Egypt, but that philosophy was born basically when we as a species gained the linguistic and cognitive capacities to think philosophical thoughts, to ask philosophical questions, which is our best guess sometime in maybe the Middle Stone Age in Africa, right? And so in that sense, we'd be saying that there's the funny consequence that we would actually be saying that there were Europeans doing philosophy many thousands of years before the ancient Egyptians, because we aren't treating ancient Egypt as the birthplace. We're treating humanity as the origin point of philosophy. And so as we go further from there, we have this episode on ancient Mesopotamia, and in a funny way, right, it's not called for by the series itself. That is to say, this is part of this larger series. And once he realized that we were going to go back to ancient Egypt, well, the fact that he had started the series originally in ancient Greece meant that, well, okay, he also needs to say something about ancient Mesopotamia. So it seems, on the one hand, like this is sort of stuck in there to cover that gap in the series as a whole, right? So there can be a history of philosophy without any gaps. But in fact, it is more actually integrated into the series than that story would make it seem, because if the birthplace of philosophy is Africa, in the sense that we have been thinking philosophical thoughts for as long as we've been human, and so ultimately we find the origin of philosophy in the Middle Stone Age, part of our evolution as a species, then the story of recorded philosophy starts when we have the story of writing. And writing is invented somewhere around the same time in ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. And these are cultures that end up influencing each other, right? And so, there's a lesson here about how understanding philosophical thought in Africa is going to very often involve understanding its connections to philosophical thought from outside of Africa, right? And here is an example of that, in the sense that by having this episode on ancient Mesopotamia, there are connections to be made, including you'll notice that episode 5 is about an Egyptian genre called the Instructions, right? Works of moral philosophy. And this is a genre that you also find in ancient Mesopotamian thought. So it's interesting in that sense that we're able to make that connection. So we've started with ancient Egypt in terms of this effort to tell the history of recorded philosophy, right? Philosophy recorded in writing. in Africa, right? And we go from there to Ethiopian philosophy, because you have a tradition of writing stretching back to the the 4th century AD, right, in Ethiopia, and a Christian tradition out of which thought there emerges. And it is, by the way, important to note that, this is where the story of Christianity comes into the story of Africana philosophy, right? Of course, especially those of us who are of the diaspora and who think about, slavery and the relationship between being introduced to Christianity for enslaved Africans, and what that means for how we think about this religion, right? It is always important to remember that despite that important part of the story of Christianity and Africans, right, what is the experience of Africans being introduced to Christianity through the slave trade in the modern era, right? The story of Christianity and Africana philosophy really starts with ancient Ethiopia, many, many centuries before that, right? And so we're looking at that story, and also looking at some early modern Ethiopian philosophers in episodes 9 and 10, and then the interview there. And then the final part of our story involving our story about the pre-colonial development of recorded Africana philosophy, right, is sub-Saharan Islamic philosophy, right? It should be noted that if you were really to think about North Africa, both in sort of the Greco-Roman era and then as it becomes Islamicized, that's not part of our series, partly because that Peter had covered in other parts of the series. So even though he had covered a lot of North African figures, for example, while covering Islamic philosophy in general, philosophy in the Islamic world, as he puts it, this part of our podcast is where sub-Saharan Africa, especially West Africa, and for example, we're talking about modern day Nigeria in episode 13, right? That's where Islamic philosophy in Africa comes into our story. But at that point, having talked about what exists in writing before European colonization, the question becomes, well, is that all there is to the story? I mean, we've only touched certain parts of the continent with all of that, right? And of course, most of the cultures of Africa before the 20th century were oral cultures, cultures without writing, right? So do we say that there was not philosophy there? And we note in episode 15 that that's a debate, and that some of the texts that began to present the view that you can find philosophy in oral cultures in Africa, that there's controversies over those texts, but nevertheless, we then do assume that you can look for the philosophy that is in or African oral traditions. And we have a series of episodes in which we're looking at how philosophers and also anthropologists have explored various topics in terms of how they come up in oral traditions in Africa. And it is important, of course, that we go thematic here, right? We're talking about time, then God, the person, communalism, divination, witchcraft, knowledge, gender, right? In terms of trying to sort of move in a chronological fashion, right? Then, we're drawing on things sometimes like proverbs, and who knows how old that proverb is, right? And other oral traditions where, it is part of the nature of the case that without writing, it's a bit harder to sort of capture how that works in time. And so it made sense in terms of this part of the series to move thematically through various discussions of various aspects of life and so on. And the last part of the last bit of the first part, locating and debating pre-colonial African philosophy, ironically involves Africana philosophy in the 20th century, right? So that's the title of the final part of the series, and what will be the second book of the series in book form. These episodes here do involve 20th century developments. So why are they here? Well, they're here because, you know, before European colonization, there is not such a thing as people describing themselves as doing African philosophy, right? So just to sort of put that point in perspective, right? We argue in the series that Africans have been doing philosophy. Africans have been thinking philosophically, asking philosophical questions, coming up with philosophical answers for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. So philosophy is really, really old in that sense in Africa. But the term African philosophy, there was no reason for that to be used by people existing in the time when before European colonization. In terms of that as a phrase, right, and the continental orientation that comes out of being pulled into the modern system of the world through slavery and colonialism, right? That is what it makes it the case that eventually in the 20th century, you have Africans who are being educated in European and North American schools, right, universities, right, getting their PhDs in philosophy. And then they're the ones to raise this question of, well, what is African philosophy? Since that's not a term that there had been reason to use, and given Eurocentric ways of thinking, it was also a term that was thought to be strange and maybe nonsensical, right? Africans don't do philosophy, right? In a Eurocentric perspective. And so the debate that ends up happening in the 20th century essentially involves the question of was there philosophy in oral traditions, right? Or is it wrong to see that as possible? Should we worry that if we try to, just describe what oral traditions, describe what we can from oral traditions through anthropological research, that will be dressing anthropology up as philosophy, right? Rather than, philosophy in a more real sense. So this is some of the debates that came up, and episode 25, for example, has to do with the idea of sage philosophy, an interesting proposal for how to find philosophy in African oral traditions. And we also talk in the final episode of that part, episode 27, about how some of the same people who raised questions about whether oral traditions was not the thing to go to find philosophy, insofar as they seemed to be doing that, it sort of seems like they came around later on to actually say, well, yeah, of course, we do actually need to investigate oral traditions to some extent as we try and build this new thing called modern African philosophy. So that's a bit about the first section. And I want to make sure I'm not, going too far ahead. I'm not doing too bad in terms of time. All right, I see a thumbs up. Yeah, because as I said, I won't be speaking much about the third part. Slavery and the Creation of Diasporic Africana Philosophy is the second part of the series, and the first episode aims to, first of all, just talk about how the slave trade, right, changes the game, right, in terms of the world and in terms of the experience of African peoples in the world, right, and leads to this thing that we call the African diaspora, right, and therefore, leads to this new element, right, in the story of Africans doing philosophy, which, as I've said, in the 20th century leads to the term African philosophy becoming a thing. But we haven't told the story yet of this European colonization, right? The reason that we had those 20th century philosophers talking about African philosophy as part of the previous part of the series is because they were interested in the question of what to make of oral traditions, right? So that's why they fit into the oral traditions part, or the pre-colonial part, so to speak, right? And there's this irony in terms of this new section about how it works thinking about time. In this episode 29, we finished that episode with a discussion of a man named Juan Latino, who is the first sub-Saharan African person of sub-Saharan African descent to publish a book in a European language, as far as we know. And he did that back in 1573, or in the 1570s, in Spain. It's a book of poetry in Latin. So we, in a sense, treat him as a kind of starting point of our story in part 2 of the series here in episode 29. But you'll remember that I pointed out when speaking of the episodes on sub-Saharan Islamic thought, that one of the episodes focused on thought in what became Nigeria. And so there's a figure in that episode, Nana Asmau, and she too was a poet. And she was writing up until her death, and she died, if I remember correctly, in 1865, right? So she dies around 300 years. She is writing and then passes away, right? About 300 years after Juan Latino. And so again, in terms of this periodization, right? How do we have her in the first part when she's writing in the 1860s, and then now we're in the second part, right? We're supposed to have left behind the pre-colonial, right? So now we're in the colonial and post-colonial, or heading to post-colonial, I guess, right? And then but now we have someone writing in the 1570s, like 300 years before the person in the pre-colonial part, right? And so the oddity there, as far as the ways that the chronologies are relating, just has to do with the fact that the story of Africans having to think about philosophy and think philosophically in a world dominated by European thought, right? That is a gradual story that unfolds, right? And Juan Latino represents an early example, right, of what is still true of myself and Professor Reed and Africana philosophers today, right? That we are thinking in a world shaped by, right, the impact of European colonialism and slavery. So we share a world with Juan Latino living in the 1570s in that interesting sense that we don't share with Nana Asmau living in the 1860s, because she's part of the Sokoto Caliphate, right? An independent state that down the line, towards the end of the century, is going to be conquered by the British, or maybe even, might even be the first decade of the 20th century. And then that colony of northern Nigeria is going to, in the north, is going to be combined with colonies to the south, and eventually we have the country that's Nigeria. But all of that colonization was still in the future when Nana Asmau was writing in the 1860s, and thus she's not part of this world shaped by European dominance and thought in this way that Juan Latino is. So that's a point about why there's this gradual expansion of this European dominance, right? The Anton Wilhelm Amo is a professional philosopher in Europe in the 18th century, right, in the 1700s, and that's a remarkable story, but also, in a sense, an odd story, right? It's not a common thing, and again, when you're thinking about how Africans are thinking philosophically in the time when Anton Wilhelm Amo was thinking philosophically, by and large, they are not thinking within the sphere of European thought. So he's an odd man out, really, when you think about the story of Africana philosophy in a way, even though we have to tell his story, and he is important to talk about. But then as we continue to look at the 18th century, we look at folks writing in English, and that includes then those who get focused on in the other episodes: Phyllis Wheatley, Lemuel Haynes, Ignatius Sancho, Benjamin Banneker, Kwame Atoba Kuguano, Olada Equiano. Right, these folks are all writing in English in the late 18th century, right? And I think that's something to think about as you are doing this course on African American philosophy, right? Is that so these people share a world, but they are on different sides of the Atlantic, right? So Ignatius Sancho, Cugoano, and Equiano, do their writing in England, right? And Benjamin Banneker, Lemuel Haynes, Phyllis Wheatley, those figures, are in the U.S., but of course, Phyllis Wheatley is able to publish her book because of a trip across to London. So the British Empire as the starting point for this important thing that, again, myself and Professor Reed are part of, that is Africana philosophical writing in English, right? That's a thing that we do. It really gets started here in the late 18th century. And again, as you look at it in its starting point, it becomes important that there's the U.S. as an independent country by the end of that century, right? But the starting point really is a world in which there is both England and the colonies, and there are Black people in both places, and they are writing, right? And so that it also, of course, includes my home, Canada. Some of the figures that we talk about, especially in episode 32, importantly, are in Nova Scotia, where I currently live. So Black history, and especially, again, the history of Black philosophical writing in English, right, has that empire-wide starting point. So there's the Haitian Revolution. That's really important. I want to, as I wrap up here, and we can get to discussion, highlight episodes 40 and 41, because they go from the late 19th century into the late 18th century into the early 19th century, right? The late 1700s into the early 1800s. And one thing that comes out is that very early on in African American philosophy, right, the philosophical thought of those who are in the United States, right, which exists by the time that we're covering in these episodes as an independent country, that very swiftly becomes, African American thought very swiftly becomes about whether to stay. Right. So this is yet another way in which you can't just have the frame of the United States, because they're already thinking about whether they should get out of the United States. Right. And one of the interesting aspects of episode 41 is the story of John Russwurm. John Russwurm was born in Jamaica, educated actually in Canada and Quebec, ended up in New York City. He and Samuel Cornish in New York City in 1827, I want to say, they found Freedom's Journal, which is the first Black newspaper in the world, right? And as the reason that there's this controversy in this episode, right, is that it's called the colonization controversy because the American Colonization Society starts Liberia, right, as a country. I mean, as a colony, right, which eventually becomes a country. And the question is whether to go to Liberia, right? And there's a lot of opposition, and John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish were both in opposition at first, but Russwurm changes his mind. He eventually does move to Liberia and becomes a governor over there. And he becomes a governor of Maryland and Liberia, a specific part of Liberia. And but so the interesting part for the history of philosophy then is the fact that in the newspaper at the time when Samuel Cornish is no longer with him, he's just the head editor of Freedom's Journal at that point. He explains why he changed his mind, right? How did he shift? Why did he decide actually no, Liberia is a good idea, we should go, right? And that's, so there's philosophical thought then that is coming out of these questions about whether to be American in the first place, right? We've got David Walker, and one thing that I find very interesting in terms of episodes 43 to 45 is that we've got three people: David Walker, Maria Stewart, and Hosea Easton. They all knew each other, especially around the latter part of the 1820s in Boston. And David Walker, he really, it's hard to overstate how important he is for really spurring thought as the 19th century wears on, because he influences Marie Stewart, Hosea Easton, I think, in very interesting ways. But as we go down here, Frederick Douglass acknowledges David Walker's importance, and Henry Highland Garnet, who we talk about after Douglass, importantly positions himself as, I would call it a Walkerite, right? Following in the path of David Walker. So the way that David Walker and his ideas, particularly on things like violent resistance, but also self-improvement, the ways that different thinkers after him take up these questions are fascinating. We have here 2 episodes on Frederick Douglass. He is, the key figure of the 19th century, and we see him come up again and again in episodes after that with Garnet, with Delaney, with the women that we look at in this episode, Sojourner Truth and Frances Harper. There's immigration to Canada. Alexander Crummell is someone who debates with Douglass at a certain point. And I'll sort of just speed down here. It's important that Africa remains a part of this second part. So for example, James Africanus Beale Horton, that's a figure who is born in West Africa and is thinking in West Africa. So we're not just looking at figures in the States. We have a lot of figures in the States, but then we also go to Haiti in episode 58. We actually have Trinidadians in episode 59. Look at Brazil in episode 60. Then after these 2 important female figures, Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells, the last 3 figures we look at are Henry McNeill Turner, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois is going to, as you may know, come back in the 20th century section, but he's already doing some of his most important work in the 1890s. And so he is this final figure that we introduce at the end of this set, at the end of this part, and then thus in terms of the book that I've been talking about, he is the final figure introduced in the book. And I hope that the reader of that book then becomes excited to see what happens in the 20th century.
That seems like a good place for us to transition. Thank you, Chike. So I'm going to just synthesize my question so that we can get to some participation. I want to ask you, number one, what do you think are some of the key things that are born out of and developed through enslavement? And number 2, what do you think that African-American philosophy's place is as we discuss a larger bracket of American philosophy?
Those seem like two different questions. Let me let me start with the second one, because I'm not going to have something very deep to say. You know, African American philosophy is a key part of American philosophy. If you are trying to tell the history of philosophical thought in America and you are leaving African Americans out, you are obviously leaving out important philosophical thought. And you know, you might say, well, okay, well, you know, when they're telling the story of American philosophy, you know, they're often talking about professional philosophers, and we weren't professional philosophers for a lot of that history, right? And you know, there's some truth to that. However, actually, if you know, when people are trying to tell interesting histories of philosophy in America, it doesn't really get started with professional philosophers, with the white folks either, right? So, you know, even whether you're talking about like a Thomas Jefferson or whoever you're talking about when talking about the history of American philosophy, it's not a story about professors predominantly before the 20th century, right? So, in other words, you know, you need to recognize that just like you want to talk about Thomas Jefferson, you want to talk about Frederick Douglass and David Walker. That's what African American philosophy is, a key part of American philosophy. However, it is important that it is also a key part of Africana philosophy, right? It is it is, you know, you can do the Venn diagram and see the overlap. You know, you don't understand it if you think it is just a part of American philosophy. You have to understand it also in the context of the history of African descended thought in the world as a whole. But I forget what the first question was.
So, at least for me, I like to try to get my students to understand what the condition of Africana people in this sense, what it's doing to sort of shape their thought. Because at least from my existential background, I'm thinking of us getting new definitions of the human, new definitions of freedom, new definitions of community, and all these sorts of things that are sort of born through those terrible circumstances. And that is a unique philosophical contribution, at least in my scope. I wanted to see what you thought in that frame.
Okay, yeah. So I think that it is right to say that the condition of enslavement, um, the condition of enslavement. Let me start it this way, right? So Africans, of course, are not the first people in history to be, are not the only people in history to be enslaved, right? I mean, whether they're the first people would involve, you know, can we actually tell the story of slavery so well that we can see it maybe in well, we don't think that we see a lot of slavery in hunter-gatherer, you know, stories, right, of humanity, right? So it probably didn't even start in Africa, right? But it's a thing that has been part of the world for, you know, many hundreds, many tens of thousands of years, especially as we got agricultural as a species. And so we live today in a time in which there is still an association in the mind with slavery and Black people. And so that's weird in terms of world history as a whole. That's not, there's no reason if you really had this bird's eye view and you treated every sort of bit of time equally, you wouldn't make that association. But it makes perfect sense that we have that because the modern period is characterized by less people being enslaved who are not African and a humongous increase in Africans being enslaved and the very important consequences of their circulation, right? You know, the bringing of them to the Americas and so on, right? So enslavement is this necessary thing. So even you know, when I say how like that last bit of part one, you know, it's these African philosophers thinking about like, well, what does African philosophy mean, right? Even them having to deal with the Eurocentric thought that African philosophy as a term doesn't make sense. Even that is literally related to the condition of enslavement as it becomes associated with Africans in the modern era, right? And so it is 100%, right, this thing that you cannot understand Africana thought in the modern era without taking into account. But I'll throw in an irony here, right? because you might think that I just said, well, okay, you can't understand modern Africana thought without it. You might say like, oh yeah, well, so what that means is when you're thinking about Africana thought as it's, emerging during the time of enslavement, that, you can't understand it without understanding the experiences of people who were enslaved. Well, hold on. I mean, that's true for some figures, but a number of figures that I mentioned by name never experienced enslavement, even though they were thinking at the time that slavery was at its height in the United States, right? But they were free and living in Boston, right? And so one thing I point out to students sometimes is that if we want to look at the experience, the historical experience of African Americans, and then let's say we want to look at the era of slavery, right? And we want to track people's lives historically, right? Like if we could do that the best we can, we would have so much to say, especially about places like Mississippi and South Carolina. I'm just going to take those two, right? Like those are two examples of places which, especially in colonial times, right, had majority Black populations, right? Like where are the Black people? They are in places like Mississippi and South Carolina. But when I'm teaching this a course, right, and they're hearing about Phyllis Wheatley, and they're hearing about Lemuel Haynes, and they're hearing about David Walker and Maria Stewart and Jose Easter, like Massachusetts is the place to be. Like most of this stuff is coming from Massachusetts. Like, so how is Massachusetts so overrepresented in the history of Africana thought when the Black folks were not there in the numbers, right? Is part of the story of what access to writing means, right? And so, yeah, to actually understand the history of Africana thought in the time of enslavement, you cannot leave that out of the story. But a number of the writers, are freed people, right? Are people who are born free and so never actually themselves experience enslavement.
Perfect. My students, do you have questions? All right, hold on. Chike, you may not be able to see them, but you should be able to hear them.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Isabella Favorite. I'm one of the students in the philosophy class. What you,
Hello.
hi, what you said about, like African philosophy, like not being a term that was used because they didn't need, or they didn't have that type of categorization, and that categorization came then from colonization. Kind of the idea of like, once you realize, because I learned a lot of philosophy in my early years at a school that was very Eurocentric and like used classic curriculum was what they called it, which was just Eurocentric. But once you realize that your like lens of philosophy is inherently European, how do you like start to approach learning about it from a different lens that is not like categorized in that way, if that makes sense?
Okay. Yeah, so part of my answer to that is going to be that you shouldn't strive for that goal in ways that pretend philosophy or the world are different than they actually are. So, and what I mean by that, first of all, is like the word philosophy really is from ancient Greek, right? So like the fact that like to talk about it, you should actually have some kind of highlighting of the ancient Greeks makes sense. If you value the term, well, we get the term from them, right? Okay, so they got to be part of the story, right? But of course, we one of the ways that I would make it sort of I think simple, why we shouldn't think that because they gave us the term that means that they gave us the thing itself, right, is if you just think of like something like storytelling, right? Do we imagine that storytelling didn't happen before people were writing stories down? That would be crazy, right? And so it's very important that ancient Egyptians and ancient Mesopotamians give us, the first recorded fictional narratives. That's awesome. But we assume that storytelling was going on long before that. And similarly, for, I think, philosophical thought. But so we acknowledge the importance of the European story, right? And it's also important that we understand the dignity of oral philosophy. And what I mean by the dignity of oral philosophy is that you don't lack philosophy by lacking writing. And so you have philosophy going on in all traditions, right? But we have to match our understanding of the dignity of oral philosophy with the power of recorded philosophy, right? So that's something that, I think is important. One of the awesome things is we can learn what ancient Egyptians thought, right? Those ancient Africans thought because of the power of writing. So we can acknowledge that power, and what that then also means in certain ways that have nothing to do with oppression, for how we get so much more from Europeans over a certain large period of time than we're getting from Africans, right? If that's not all about oppression, that's partly about the question of who is doing writing, right? And so we recognize the dignity of oral philosophy while also recognizing the power of recorded philosophy. And, another thing that I would say is that just like writing is power, I think that a sense of global consciousness is valuable, I think, right? And so what that also means is valuing the global consciousness that comes to Africans in modernity. But then that's the hard part, because you actually have to value the sense of global consciousness, which is the very foundation of identifying as an African, right? Again, you need a sense of the globe to identify as an African. So there's this thing that I do value because I identify as an African of global consciousness, but the ways that Africans come to be conscious of the globe is in such a, it's through the terror of the slave trade and then also colonialism, right? And so there's the difficulty of holding, again, those two thoughts, right? Of the value of global consciousness, but also the horror of imperialism. So those are, I guess, two examples of, trying to hold thoughts together that I would hope, would be helpful to what you were talking about, trying to see non-Eurocentrically.
Hi, Dr. Jeffers, can you hear me?
Yes, I think I can hear you.
My name is Ali. I'm also in Dr. Reed's class. So my question is a little bit about how you talked about, the term Africana philosophy not, being accepted and not being part of the mainstream. In class, Dr. Reed has also talked about how it wasn't until recently that you could be getting a PhD in Black philosophy. So in 2025, what is it like now, and how accepted has Africana philosophy and Black philosophy been into the mainstream?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. I appreciate the question because it's amazing how much can happen in 25 years, right? So I got my PhD in 2010, and 2004 to 2010 is my time in grad school. I lived in Chicago. I was at Northwestern University, and the term Africana philosophy is in the title of my dissertation. So it's called the Black Gift, Cultural Nationalism and Cosmopolitanism in Africana Philosophy. I don't think that it's the first. It's crazy. I'm actually just realizing that that's something I should verify. I don't think I'm the first, right? But it was absolutely not a common thing, right? For that title, for that phrase to be in the title of the dissertation still in 2010. Yeah, and like it is so much more accepted as a thing in the world of philosophy, and then also thankfully the way that philosophy then filters down to students through teaching, right? There's lots of people who are not of African descent, who also feel like a pressure to like, how am I including Africana philosophy, right? Like they're thinking about that as they're constructing their courses that aren't even on Africana stuff generally, right? But they're trying to see how they can have some Africana inclusion, and that's just such a different thing from even when I was a grad student. And another simple example would be that at the time that I was a grad student, and I knew that Du Bois that was going to be a big figure in my dissertation. Often, if I was talking to other philosophy grad students, I'm having to introduce who he is because they've never heard his name, right? If you're a philosophy grad student in 2025, it is much weirder for you to have never heard Du Bois' name and you need him introduced to you like a completely new figure, right? So again, that's like, yeah, so man, like change happens quickly, I think is my main answer to the question.
I think we're gonna take a couple of Google ones, and I know I got some in the chat, so I'm gonna look at that. Anybody have a question from the floor in person? All right.
Hi, Dr. Jeffers. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Stuart Glynn, I'm one of Corey's colleagues. I don't know much about the history of philosophy, but I'm going to ask you a question anyway. One of the things that I've been struck by is how much in the period that you're talking about here in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, there was so much of this sort of classical influence of Cicero and Seneca and people like that. Those were the sorts of people that were being read. And I am curious how much, I mean, and I know that some of the Black philosophers in the period were reading those people too. But given that those were slave cultures, was that something people were aware of and thinking about that in the Greco-Roman world? And did that have an impact on how they interpreted that classical tradition?
So did what have an impact on how they interpreted the classical tradition?
Awareness of the, just the rampant enslavement that was going on in, say, in the Roman period where these people were writing. Was that something that, it's one of those things that was weird about the drawing on these figures in the Enlightenment period.
Okay. I think I understand. I mean, the fight against slavery, the fight to abolish slavery, that really gets going during this time period, I mean, is really an importantly new thing. And so I don't think that it sticks out as weird necessarily to those who are being influenced by the classical tradition, that also that there was slavery in the world, in that world, because it had been this not so challenged thing until recently, right? In terms of there being like, I mean, like the Quakers, importantly, are pioneers that get going early, but in terms of an anti-slavery discourse, it feels like such a new thing in this period in certain ways, I think. But yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about the classical influence is if you take, the use of a term like Ethiopian by someone like Phyllis Wheatley, right? The both in the Greek version of the Bible, right, and then also in the King James version, there's this word Ethiopia, which doesn't necessarily refer actually originally to what is now the country of Ethiopia, but it's this ancient Greek term that because of that being the way that someone like Phyllis Wheatley's sense of historical and global consciousness is structured, it makes sense to her to identify as an Ethiopian, because Ethiopia means something like those dark people who are after Egypt, right? Thinking from like a Greco-Roman or also a Hebrew point of view, right? And so the way that term then comes down to represent being Black African in the 18th century and the 19th century is an interesting thing. And then it becomes weird to read it from our current standpoint, because in the 20th century, then there's a country that's really importantly called Ethiopia. And so when we say Ethiopians, we mean people from that country. But in the 19th century, people are still using it just to mean like Black Africans. And that's part of that classical and both the Greco-Roman and also the Judeo-Christian development of diasporic Africana consciousness.
Any other questions? I don't see anything new in the chat. If anybody who's watching online wants to ask something. Anybody else from the room? Well, I'll just ask one final question then. This is going to be so broad stroke, but what is one thing that you would love students to gain or realize about African American philosophy, just in general, but really abstracted away from the condition of enslavement, right? Like, what is one takeaway that you want students to have about Black thought as it's evolving in the United States that may or may not have to do with that condition?
Yeah. Yeah, part of the story of African American philosophy in a way that necessarily involves the condition of enslavement. It's very unsurprising that I'm going to say that, right? Like, you're saying abstract away from, but we have, of course, already said you literally can't, right? So there's that, right? But like knowing that, like, that especially as, a particularly live topic in a certain fashion, that it, stops after the 1860s, right? Then there's the question of like, well, what draws that together with much, much later thought, including how people are thinking philosophically as African Americans today. And one of the things that I will throw out there as sort of a key thing that you're going to keep seeing all the time once you start to look for it, right, is just what you could say is the insider-outsider status, right? What it means to be inside of this thing called the US, right? But then to be outsiders through forms of exclusion, right? And there being also the question of what exactly you want in light of that conflicting state. Do you want inclusion? Well, do you want inclusion so much that you want, sameness, right? Or do you want to actually remain something of an outsider in the sense of being, racially, ethnically, or something like that, distinct, right? And having a sense of strong connection to African people in other parts of the world, right? A sense of Pan-Africanist identity, right? So in other words, like, what are the ways in which you want to be included? What are the ways in which you want to remain unique, special, different, not just any other American? That tension, I think, is what animates so much of African American thought. And I want to, emphasize in wrapping up this answer that to give any kind of answer of like, here's a broad theme, right, to that question is necessarily going to fail to take the diversity of African American thought. African American thought is so diverse based on the time, based on where are people coming from, based on various dynamics, right, of that, period of African American philosophical thought, right? So it's, a wild diversity in so many ways making the question of like, how could you find just threads going all the way through hard, right? And I'm saying my best attempts as like at like how can you find a thread that's going to take you all the way through African American thought? It's that like the weirdness of being insider and outsider, and what do you want? Do you want both somehow? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's wonderful to me. I can't help but think about Christina Sharp's work, right? And what she gets to with the concept of the wake, right? We are constantly existing and living through the unfolding of slavery's wake, right?
Yeah.
We can just think not just enslavement, but all anti-Black oppression toward African people, that we're constantly being shaped by it. And I really feel like we're in this time period that wants us to say we're past this, that happened, it's not continuing to happen, we're post whatever. And I think there's actually power in saying, no, we're in this constant unfolding. It's shaping everything that's around us. There's no politics that we're witnessing that is not influenced by these historical moments. And that goes as far back as slavery, it goes far back as what we know before that, right? It is the global story of colonization. It is the continuing unfolding of colonization, right? So in order for us to get words about anything with Blackness, we have to deal with that constant unfolding, right? But you have already started to segue. Dr. Hale is going to pick up a lot of extracts and we talk about Black existentialism next week. And we talk about people like the who's getting to what you're talking about, like the double consciousness focus. Did you want to jump in? You had something?
I heard double consciousness. Honestly, it got a little hard to hear and understand. Just in terms of the mic, and how easy it was to follow that. I heard, I lost you at a certain point. And now I can't hear you at all. Technology. I mean, I even though I can't hear, I can say something about double consciousness real quick. Which is that Du Bois uses the term in the first chapter of The Souls of Black Folk, and then never again. It's not a thing that he spent a bunch of time like saying like, this is double consciousness, that is over. He didn't, if you take other terms from The Souls of Black Folk, like the veil, he was more attached to that. He brought that one back a lot more, right? So there is this interesting thing, right? Why are we so attached to something that he dropped it once and moved on, right? All right. And my answer is connected to my previous answer, right? In other words, if I'm right that this insider outsider thing is in some sense like the most fundamental thing that you can kind of like see at work in African American thought generally, right? Double consciousness turns out to be like double consciousness as a phrase, but then also specifically in the context of the actual paragraph in which he uses it and the eloquence of that and the easiness of quoting it and so on, right? Like the work that it manages to do in a few sentences, right? Like do so much to tap at that fundamental insider outsider thing that's why it became well after the fact, right? It was really by the late 20th century also that we're becoming that focused on it as a term. And that's still true with us now. But we're attached to that term because, Du Bois really did something there in terms of tapping into the insider outsider thing. Thank you so much. In case you can't hear our claps. Yes, I can't hear your claps, but I see some of them and I appreciate all of them. And I appreciated getting to talk about Africana philosophy with you all today.
All right, thank you, Chike.
And I can't hear you now. Thank you.
If you need to VCR scan, come see me. Otherwise, thank you all so much. And our next one will be next Thursday on Black existentialism, focusing on the 1920s.
Take care, everybody.
I don't see why Thank you, Corey, really appreciate it. I think myself in the campus community.
No, it's really not. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Bye, Dr. Reed. Hey, Bill.
How are things going? Yeah.
Providing. It's different,
Yeah.
but it's better.
Yeah.
I'm on the kids like surgery.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So that